much to tell, you don't really kind of go down one alley and then,
Yes, of course. And you were telling me that your mother lived in Greece for a long time.
Yes, she did.
How come? How did he?
Well, her father, Sadiq Molasi, was kind of a businessman. That's what they call him. But he was living in Greece, and they were working in Greece. I mean, Greece is so close to the border, really, when you think about it. But they lived in Thessaloniki, and she lived, I think, 17 years in Thessaloniki. But again, if you ask my mother about these details, she wouldn't give you details. It was the past. She would say it's the past. But she spoke Greek beautifully. In fact, I had Greek friends at the university when I was at the university. And in fact, one of my friends was George Papandreou's son, who then went back to Greece and so on. But George and my mother would speak in Greek. And he would always say how beautiful her Greek was. She spoke Italian fluently, spoke German fluently. My mother was multilingual, and she was an extraordinarily intelligent woman too, analytical about things. But she lived in Greece. She had a great fondness for Greek things, but she was definitely not Greek. In fact, we had the visit of my father's sister Kimete in 1972, I think it was. That was a disaster for many reasons. But her biggest mistake was to say to my mother that she was Greek. That was like she just didn't know that she had just crucified herself, And my mother said, "Greek? Who told you I'm Greek? I'm Albanian." And so, no, but she had great fondness. She was imbued with some of the rituals of Greek life, Like I remember Easter time, she was from the Bektashi sect, right? So a very liberal Muslim sect. And, but at Easter, we celebrated Easter with red eggs and things. And and sometimes she would light candles and things like that. She had this, I think my mother was deeply spiritual in some ways. She believed in angels. She believed in it's very interesting, kind of had this need for something more, And I think she had found that, I think, in this world of ritual that she brought with her from Greece. It was very foreign to us. We would look at it with some amazement and, loved the eggs, but didn't get the candles, But let her, that was her way of being who she was, and we allowed it. That's not fair. We respected that's who she was, but we found it very odd, But my mother, in typical of my mother, she didn't care. She did what she wanted, Anyway, yeah.
Did you have a religious education?
I beg your pardon?
Did you have a religious education?
We had exactly the same education that I've given my daughters. I think my father and my mother, my father was, they were both Muslim, but we were, I think what we were educated in was values. We were given, I think, an education that would provide us with a moral compass. There were things that were important: honesty. Oh my gosh, honesty and humility. These were I don't know how many times my father said these were the two principles that should guide us: honesty and humility.
But not necessarily connected to the Quran or Islam?
No, completely separate. I don't think they were, either of them, members of any kind of organized religious order. But we had a deep sense of, we were given this idea, I mean, if somebody stole or something like that, that would have been No, it was moral compass. You know, it was the idea that these are the values by which you should live your life if you want to live a good life. And a good life is a moral life. And so they demanded honesty, they demanded loyalty, they demanded generosity. It was very important to share. Yeah, these were the things that I think marked us and became part of who we are. And also, and it became a theme in our life, it came from my father, but it was also embodied in my mother, the underdog, you know, those who are excluded, those who need help. You know, my parents didn't have a lot of money, but I remember any time there was somebody who was in difficulty, my mother would find us help them. You know, you had to give of yourself. This was that was my religious education, and my daughters. I studied with Northrop Frye, who was minister of the United Church of Canada, but was one of the major literary critics of the 20th century. And I studied with him two things. One of them, Foundations of Western Culture. So I studied mythology and the Bible with him. And then I also studied the course he gave, Bible as Literature. And I understood from that course how man has searched for meaning, you know, the patterns, the lessons that recur and are reinterpreted from myth to biblical setting and so on. And basically the search for meaning in a way itself is a value. And so what I tried to do with my daughters was to give them access to those patterns. So I encourage them to know the biblical stories. They still ask me, Mummy, tell us the story, because they haven't yet invested in that. My younger one maybe a bit more. But the myths, knowing the myths, understanding what they're teaching us. So it was more through a literary education that I was engaging with this same teaching about, again, what is a good life? How do you fulfill your potential as a human being? How do you become a moral person? My husband was more influenced by Jesuit teaching, action, hope, and action. But both of us were giving them the idea that action is necessary, I just didn't think of it as a Jesuit model. I thought of it as something else. But ultimately, we're teaching the same things. And but I've never been a member of any organization, never been a member of a political party, although my views are very strong. And never go to a church, never been a member of a church or anything, any organized religious thing. I just don't trust them. I just don't feel I can fit into it because everything, I have too many independent thoughts about things. I can't do it. I can't sort of reconcile myself to belonging to something so structured.
I was about to ask, and you were talking about your ethical education. Mm-hmm. I was about to ask you about your intellectual educations, but you began a little bit mentioning Northrop Frye. But is there anything else you can add about that? What was your strongest intellectual influence on your life? Obviously, maybe that's also was out of the family when you went to university.
Yes.
You're reading.
I think that I'm a literature student, and I think that my reading, intellectual education, I studied also with Bloom, the closing of the American Harold Bloom.
Harold Bloom.
Yeah, I was lucky. I think I was very lucky. I had very challenging professors at the university, but also my father. My father read, John Stuart Mill with me, because I couldn't understand it. I was only 16, I think, and I had to read On Liberty, and I couldn't get it. So I went to him and I said, I don't get it. He sat and read it with me. And he clarified. He was a very good teacher, you know. I don't know, a lot of things. I think reading has always been something I've loved, and I've read everything and anything I can get my hands on. I'm reading less now than I was before, I think, for a lot of reasons, but I was fascinated by the mythology. I read a lot growing up. I love fairy tales. I loved, yeah, I read a lot. I don't know. That's a good question. I think as a child, I think the myths, this wonderful world of wondrous things that can happen, transformations, you know, the metamorphoses and so on. That gave me a lot of hope, actually, because, you know, things can change, things can become magical, you know. And then encountering Northrop Frye, the challenge of being able to keep up with some of the things that he
Lucky
was.
you. Lucky you with these professors.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. And then what was interesting about him, he was so gentle. So he would blush. He was such a gentle man. That also teaches you something about humility and how you know, knowledge and status does not necessarily mean, you know, arrogance and all of that. So that too, the lessons of humility. But I think I'm thinking, you know, I have to say that I think Virginia Woolf was one of the main influences for me. I think she made me think a lot about myself as a woman, what I need to exist, how to exist, her struggles, not only psychological, but, you know, creative struggles, devotion to something. But I think I said, you know, the room of one's own, that was like a lightning bolt in my life, you know. I felt that she was telling me something about what I needed to do to really exist. You know, I had never lived, no one had given me the right to privacy, you know. So suddenly I was claiming it, and I was searching in my own way for things that you know, were maybe going to be difficult to reconcile with my Albanian identity, you know, how to be free, how to express. So she was influential, but my reading, my literature was you know, I read Plato, and I was trying to figure all this thing out, you know, and I read, I'm trying to think, you know, like there was so much. I remember reading Madame Bovary and being overwhelmed, you know, by this woman in this dissatisfaction, you know. And I thought, well, why are so many women that I'm around dissatisfied, you know? All these things were happening at the same time. There was a kind of questioning. And then I think that when I came away from the intellectual world, married, entered into the Albanian world, then all that was being tested. Then it took on a real meaning. It wasn't just abstract thinking about dissatisfaction, privacy, the right to exist as you decide, your relationship with truth. All these things began to mean to be battlegrounds. And I had to stand up for myself. I had to fight. And I didn't ever want to abandon my femininity, to be honest. I wanted to remain a woman, not an angry woman, a woman. All the strength that means, but to confront some of these things. And it wasn't always easy, but I did it. I think I did it fairly well. And I've raised two daughters that are independent-minded, strong, willful, generous. I've succeeded because I think I modeled for them something else. And I think that that's important to me. So my intellectual journey began with fairy tale and myth and ended with, well, it didn't end, it's a constant, isn't it? I mean, you're always becoming, but I still continue, you know. Now I don't read so much fiction. I used to read a lot of fiction. Now I read a lot of philosophy now, you know. I'm reading a lot about identity now, a lot about identity now. But I think it's just, yeah, I think I've wondered a bit too much on that answer because I haven't worked it out myself, I think.
That's great. It's just sometimes we think as we speak.
Yes, yes.
And it's very interesting because from what you said, you know, previous conversation, but also you hinted that you had an encounter with your husband. It was love, right? It was romantic love. But then you talk about all the things, you mentioned things you did together. So there was also friendship and collaboration. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? You know, why were you in New York? How were the circumstances when you met your husband?
Yeah,
you were in Toronto. We left you in Toronto. You were in Melbourne, then in Toronto, and then now in New York.
Yeah.
Well, how it happened?
It was. You know, look, my father's influence on my life is really profound. But I think that in a way, he led me to Idris. Okay, so my father dies in 1974, November 1974. I have begun teaching, and I finally have a little bit of money. So I decide with my brother in the summer of 1977 that we're going to do something fun. And so he and I, my brother Dervish and I, decide to backpack around England, Wales, and Scotland. So we leave. And I have grieved my father. I'm still grieving my father. I'd also had a platonic, I have to stipulate, but a very meaningful relationship with one of my friends at the university. And that had not worked out. And so I was also grieving that. And so we go on this trip through, you know, backpacking, and then I return in August of 1977. I'm back in Toronto with my brother. I'm strong, I'm healthy because we walk so much, and I'm feeling. I actually wrote in my journal that I was going back like at the end of a Fellini movie, you know. Everything had worked out, there was harmony, you know. I felt good. And then I hear that there is a meeting of the Legaliteti Party in New York in November. And I realized that it will be I felt it was important that a member of the family be there, although I have no monarchist tendencies whatsoever, absolutely none. But I just thought the presence, the Mitrovica should be there. So I tell my mother that, and she's not keen about this because she knew that it was really a man's world, and it was going to be, you know, like 300 men, and you're going to be the only woman there, you know. So I insist and argue that my godfather, Abbas Kupi's son, Petrit Kupi, would be there and I'd be with him. And finally she agrees, a bit kind of just said, oh, go, you know. So I go. And on the 27th of November, 1977, I'm sitting with my godfather waiting. I've just arrived 15 minutes before because I didn't really want to hear all the speeches. And then it's time to get up for lunch. Get up. And this man, I've been hearing, he's speaking French, sitting in front of me, smoking a cigar. And he gets up, and my godfather says, I'd like to introduce you. And he introduces me to Idris Basha. Idris Basha says to me, oh, I'm sorry, you know, in a very funny, I'm sorry, I don't speak English. And I said, That's okay, I speak Albanian. But I said, "Ska problem, folim skip." So he kind of went like this, you know, and the moment he shook my hand, I cannot explain it to you, I knew he was going to marry me. I knew I was going to marry him. I went out of that room with my godfather and I said, "Who is he?" And he said, "He's a doctor. He's a doctor," he said. "He studies in France." It was all wrong. He was not that at all. He had studied medicine, but he was a psychoanalyst and he was in France. I called my mother. I go to a phone and I call my mum. And I say, "You have to come to New York." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Because I've met the man I'm going to marry. But I won't marry him unless you give me your permission." And she, "Are you crazy?" And she really, you know, absolutely. She came though, and he, on the Monday, he asked me to marry him, and I accepted.